Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about how stories get made. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the various components of a story. In that, we're going to be looking at Freytag's triangle. So Freytag was a writer, and he theorized that every story needs an introduction, it needs a rising action, it needs to have a climax, a falling action, and then some sort of a resolution. So today we're going to be looking at what that looks like in a story using probably one of my favorite movies and definitely one of the most memeable, Shrek.
Somebody once told me.
So the first part of your story is your exposition. So that's where your author sets up the way things are. This is where you get information about your characters. So who are they? Where do they come from? And then sometimes this is where your author gives you a little hint about what's to come. Take Shrek, for example. Shrek in the beginning is totally happy living in his swamp. He has a routine. He loves what he's doing. So once we start getting this idea that something is like comfortable to a character, we know that's when it's going to get disrupted, which leads us to our rising action. So in the rising action, usually that's what happens for a lot of the story. With our rising action, our character gets disrupted from their place of comfort and they have to go on a series of challenges. In Shrek's case, this happens when Lord Farquaad sends all of the fairy tale creatures to live in his swamp.
What are you doing in my swamp?
Shrek has to start on this quest of getting his swamp back by saving the Princess Fiona that Lord Farquaad is so interested in. Through all of this, he winds up encountering a lot of different trials and challenges throughout the way. Usually, it's going to be a small series of conflicts and resolutions, and conflicts and resolutions. And this is normally where we go ahead and we meet all of our other characters too. In Shrek, this is where we meet Lord Farquaad, this is where we meet the donkey, and this is where we meet Fiona. All characters that are really important, but they come along after we've already established the main character in the beginning. So, what does this rising action take us towards? It takes us towards our climax. So with the climax, this is usually the most intense part of an entire story. This is the part of the movie that you usually don't want to get up during. Our characters are usually forced to make some sort of a choice. They're caused to change. Although the rising action and the falling action can take a while, the climax usually is over in a matter of minutes. It feels a lot shorter than the rest of the parts because it forces the character to take everything that they've gone through in their rising action and then learn from it and make a decision. In the case of our movie Shrek, this is when Shrek is finally forced to decide if he is going to crash Lord Farquaad's wedding to Fiona and tell her how he really feels, even though it may not work out, or if he's just going to go back to his swamp and leave things the way that they were before. So once the climax has happened and our characters have been forced to make a choice, the falling action tends to be where they deal with the results of their choices. Where the characters have to deal with the choices that they made in the moment of the climax and have to have some sort of an ending for our story. In Shrek, that comes in the form of a big old musical number where everybody gets together and sings a song and we assume that they've lived happily ever after. A lot of times in movies that tend to be a little bit more suspenseful, for example, we'll wind up seeing like a sudden last change to keep us on the end of our seats. But ultimately, the falling action leads us towards our resolution. So with the resolution, this is kind of the last few moments of any sort of a story, right? So this is where we start seeing, do our characters live happily ever after in most stories? Or does it have kind of a sad ending, like most tragedies? This usually ends with just a specific moment. In Shrek, it's them riding off into the sunset after their big wedding/musical number. A lot of times, the characters do get a second to reflect on what's happened throughout the story. That's sort of like staring off into the sunset type of a moment. But it also gives us time to go ahead and reflect on what's happened too, and see how did these characters change since we've been through them as they developed in their rising action. We saw the choices that they made during the climactic moment, and then we see how the story shapes up in the falling action. So why do we still study Freytag's triangle? For one, it's really nice to know what you're getting yourself into when you're going into a story. You know that there's going to be a problem that's introduced at the beginning that disrupts the way things normally are. You know that people are going to have to react and start changing, and usually it results in some sort of big climactic event. After a climax, though, it's helpful to note that there is going to be some sort of a resolution for a story. That's why a lot of times when people have beef with a story, it's usually going to be the ending. Because if you spend all of this time building towards this one big moment and then nothing, a lot of times that winds up being really frustrating for the audience to experience. So, keep this in mind as we start writing our own stories, especially with this personal narrative assignment. We want to make sure that we solidify where we start off with for our exposition. We explain what circumstances got us to our one big moment, and we make sure too that we trace what has happened afterwards, getting us to our conclusion and helping us be a little bit different humans than we were before. I'm gonna go deal with my cats now.
Get your game on, go play. Hey now, you're a rock star. Get the show on, get paid.